Hi, welcome to episode 10 of Science Literacy. And since it's the fifth episode, or in this case, the 10th episode, um, every 5 episodes we are going to the library. And again, I'm going to my library. I have quite a few books. Many of them I've read, some of them I haven't read. And so I am just wanting to share the books that I have read and given me the knowledge that I have so that maybe, again, something that you might be interested in, or I talk about a book that you have heard about or never heard about, hopefully, and want to look into. So, that's what we're looking at today. I'm going to be talking about 5 books. Once again, this time, though, the theme is not about the coronavirus, um, as the last one kind of was, talking about zoonotic diseases and such. This book is about, or this particular episode is going to be about books that are from the history of science. One of the things that I absolutely love is the history of science. I never thought I'd be in that particular category or that I would fall in love with that particular topic, but I have. Um, so I love the history of the Earth. I love the history of life. I love the history of the universe. I also love the history of my science, of any science, really, for that matter. But specifically, paleontology, geology, biology, astronomy. So, really, anything I'm fascinated by. So I'm going to talk about 5 books, and I'm going to do them in kind of a chronological order, not by when they were published by these, but by the subject matter. And finish it up with an all-encompassing book in the sense that it covers many different eras um, of science history. So, and actually, I have the copies of these books. The last episode, all of the books that I were talked about were either audiobooks or on my Kindle. These I actually have hard copies of. So I will be showing you the book. I'll also probably put an image in the in one of the corners of the screen so that you see the cover of the book. I'll give you some of the details, who wrote it, when it was published, and how many pages that it has, and give you a bit of an some information about the book, what it's about, what's in it, what I gleaned from it, what my thoughts are of it, and things like that. So let's get started. The first book up today is Eye of the Lynx by David Friedberg. So, Eye of the Lynx by David Friedberg, Galileo, his friends, and the beginnings of modern natural history. Now, this book was utterly fascinating. I came across this book on Amazon and several years ago, and I just felt that looks intriguing. I love the history of science, as I mentioned, and it talked about Galileo, so I thought, okay, let me read this book. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. This book is utterly fascinating. It talks about back in the late 1500s in Italy, there was a prince of all people. Italy was run by various ruling families, and one of them, the prince, I guess the ruler of that particular area, was actually a man of science. What we today would call science, then was called like natural philosophy or something along those lines. He was most interested in mushrooms, and the critical thing about this was it was thought at that time that mushrooms served as an intermediary between rocks and vegetable matter or plants. So plants could turn into rocks or rocks could turn into plants. They weren't sure which way it went or what represented that transition, but it was felt that mushrooms were possibly one of those transitional phases between rocks and plants. And so he was quite interested in that. And so he set up a somewhat quasi secret society in the northern portion of Italy. And they called themselves the Lynxian Society or the Lynx Society. And so they felt that the lynx had really good eyesight, and so the lynx would see things better than any other animal. Um, and so they felt they were seeing things better than anybody else around them. Eventually, the number of their little group grew to include a doctor. I think the doctor was kind of, if I remember correctly, the doctor was in a fairly disgraced fashion. He was not practicing. He kind of had very big confidence issues, but he was almost a whiz at botanical knowledge. So they kind of tried to prop him up and give him encouragement, but he always seemed to just fall into massive despair. There were other people who are interested, of course, in rocks. There were people who are interested in the heavens, the stars, and then there's Galileo. Galileo was probably the was not probably was the most famous member of the society. He was also one of the last members of the society in the sense that he was not a founding member. They kind of came across him and they invited him into their group, but they spent an incredible amount of their time trying to hem him in, not because they disagreed with what he was saying, but because they were worried that he would say something that would either get them in trouble or himself in trouble or both. And they spent a lot of time reeling him back in. They would edit his books. They would give him suggestions. Don't say it this way. Say it this way. And many, many, many times they probably saved his butt from getting into more trouble than he actually did get into. So it's interesting to think that without this particular secret society, just how much trouble Galileo could have gotten into. Now remember, Galileo did not get in trouble for his ideas about the solar system per se. He got in trouble because in 1616 he promised never to teach the Copernican theory of heliocentrism ever again. That was running afoul of the church. Again, his friends in the Lynxian Society tried to get him to where he was not butting heads with the church quite so much. But he just could not keep his mouth shut. He was one of those people that felt, I know this is right. I have to tell somebody, including everybody. And he didn't care if he got in trouble or not. Um, so in 1632, he gets in trouble again, not necessarily because of the language he used, because he was using local Italian dialects, which was felt to be kind of scandalous, because anybody who could read Italian could read it, as opposed to Latin, which was the learned language. Um, but he got in trouble because he could not help himself. He had to make a comment about heliocentrism versus geocentrism. And that's what he got in trouble for. And once again, his friends in the Lynxian Society desperately tried to keep him out of as much trouble as possible. But again, just wasn't just they just couldn't get it done. Um, at least not to Galileo's benefit necessarily. So again, it's a very dense book, as you can see. It's 513 pages, published in 2002. Again, it's by David Friedberg. It's called Eye of the Lynx. Utterly fascinating book about the early history of science, the beginnings of science, again, around the time of Galileo. So we're talking the end of the 1500s, the beginning of the 1600s. Centered in Italy, but it does spread from Italy into France and Switzerland and Germany a little bit. But again, it was centered mostly in Italy because of that's who the principal players were. So again, Eye of the Lynx, highly recommend this book. It is dense though, as I mentioned. So if you're looking for light reading, this is not going to be on your book list. But if you are interested in again Galileo or the notion that mushrooms might serve as a transitional phase between plant and animal, or sorry, plant and mineral. Because remember, they basically broke everything down into three categories: mineral, vegetable, and animal. So mushrooms don't fit really any of those categories. So they had really a big trouble figuring that out. But again, Eye of the Lynx, really interesting book. Moving forward in time a little bit, have you ever wondered why we use something called the metric system? Well, not us in America. We're way too good for that. We're actually too stubborn for that. But have you ever wondered why we don't use the metric system and why the rest of the world does, where it came from? Well, I've got the book for you. This book is called The Measure of All Things. Um, Sorry, dude, got a glare there. The Measure of All Things, The 7-Year Odyssey and Hidden Error That Transformed the World by Ken Adler. This book is actually pretty interesting. I picked it up at a used bookstore, I believe, or a library book sale, something along those lines. And it caught my attention because saw Measure, and the Measure of All Things, and so I was like, well, okay, that sounds like the history of science, so I'll give it a shot. Interesting stuff. So basically, the metric system was got its founding during the French Revolution. So the book starts off by talking about how if you traveled from one town to another in France, you could buy the exact same thing, let's say a loaf of bread, and get a completely different product. So in one town, the loaf might be a certain length, a certain weight, and cost a certain amount of money. If you go just down the road to the next town and order a same loaf of bread, the loaf might be smaller, might be thinner, and might cost more because you're in a different town. There was no standardization. And so with the French Revolution being what the French Revolution was there at the end of the 1700s, they wanted to kind of standardize the country. They wanted everybody to be unified in a way. Similar, they were taking their cues from the American Revolution. And so they started off by length. Let's focus on length. And they decided to take length from nature. The measurement for length will be coming from nature. So they hatched this really ridiculous idea. Ridiculous because it is incredibly arbitrary, but they deemed from the equator to the North Pole is 90 degrees. Okay, 90 degrees up. Um, so they decided, okay, so if we know the distance of 1 degree, we can figure out the distance between the equator and the North Pole. We just multiply by 90, right? Well, okay, that sounds fantastic, but that's a really big measurement. So they decided on a very arbitrary, and it really is arbitrary, of 1/10 millionth of that distance. So 1/10 millionth of that distance would be uh, their set length. So they just needed a piece of land that was not necessarily near the equator, but about halfway between the equator and the North Pole, so that the land was approximately uh, their thinking even, I guess. So they needed a piece of land, 1 degree of latitude, at least in length. So they said, well, where can we find that? Well, America, Thomas Jefferson was ambassador to France, and he was Secretary of State, spent a lot of time in France, and huge on France. And he said, hey, why don't you choose our country? Our country is huge, lots of flat land. It's gigantic. You can pick any sort of location that you want and measure to your heart's desire. And it'd be perfect. They chose France. Obviously, they're French, so they chose France. So they sent out just two guys, one to the north of France, one to the south of France, and they measured their way back to Paris. Um, and they surveyed their way back to Paris, and so this is in the middle of the French Revolution. Numerous times, it took them 7 years to measure this distance from south of France or South France to Paris, and from North France to Paris. And it took them 7 years because they were imprisoned, because they were thought to be lords, or the nobility, and the commoners didn't trust them. They were thought to be spies. But here you got two guys walking around in the middle of essentially a civil war, carrying surveying instruments, building towers, and surveying the countryside. They were clearly spies. One guy got captured in Spain because France is not quite a full degree of latitude. So he had to go into Spain, and he was captured there because, again, he was thought to be a spy. His papers that were given to him to allow him free access to the country didn't really go very far as convincing people that he was legitimate. Anyway, they figured it out, or they got it finally measured. 7 years. They crunched the numbers. It took them a lot of time to fine tune everything. They actually discovered that the Earth is not a nice smooth curve, that it's very lumpy, and that threw off their measurements. Finally, they came up with the number 1/10 millionth of the distance between the North Pole and the equator. That was what they called the meter. They adopted it countrywide. Many people didn't use it because they were like, whatever, this is nothing. Um, and then Napoleon took over and got rid of it altogether. Then later, France adopted it. England was a little slow getting on board with the metric system, but they finally realized, hey, this is actually kind of a neat idea. From length, they were able to determine all sorts of other different measurements and standardize those. But then you have America, the lone holdout. In fact, we're one of, I think, 3 countries in the entire world that doesn't use the metric system. Why? Well, it all goes back to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was so mad that America was not chosen that he basically was like, we're never using it. And so we didn't. And then I think in the early 1900s, Congress passed a law saying it's not illegal to use the metric system. Not, hey, we're going to switch to the metric system, but it's not illegal to use the metric system. It's utterly ridiculous, all because somebody got their feelings hurt. But it is an amazingly interesting book about the history of the metric system, why it even exists, and the trials and tribulations of these 2 surveyors as they tried to figure out the length of the planet, essentially. So again, it's called Measure of All Things, 7-Year Odyssey and the Hidden Era That Transformed the World by Ken Adler. It's 422 pages, published in 2002. I do recommend it. Maybe not as thoroughly as I did Eye of the Lynx, but it is a fantastic book. And again, if you're interested in the metric system and why it's there, what it means and all that, check this book out. All right. Around that same time, around the 1800s or so, we have a German explorer who actually is a German nobleman who decided he wants to go exploring. He wanted to see the world, but specifically South America. And his name is Alexander von Humboldt, and he completely revolutionized how we see the world around us. So I give you Humboldt's Cosmos. Sorry, the glare is bad. Humboldt's Cosmos. Alexander von Humboldt and the Latin American Journey That Changed the Way We See the World by Gerard Helfrich. Look, I had never heard of Alexander von Humboldt. I saw this book again in a library book sale or a used bookstore, and I saw the word cosmos. Cosmos means the universe, and it said Humboldt's Cosmos, and I'm like, I'm game. History of the universe, history of the world, whatever. I'm good for it. This guy was amazing, just amazing. He was trained to be a mining engineer, geologist. He was from a fairly wealthy family, but he wanted to get away from it and go travel. He wanted to be an adventurer, an explorer. So he goes to South America, and he travels through South America with one other guy, a Frenchman named Aimé Bonpland, who was a botanist. And so Humboldt and Bonpland traveled all around South America. They went across through the Amazon, the Orinoco. They went across the Andes Mountains. They sketched them. They measured them. They collected them. Essentially, they faced malaria. They faced hordes of mosquitoes to the point where they couldn't breathe at times on the river because the mosquitoes were so bad. But why did they stick to the river? Because on the shore were crocodiles and jaguars and all these other really dangerous things. it's a fascinating book and a fascinating story. This is not the book he wrote, but it's a book that kind of tells his story as he traveled through South America and basically opened the world's eyes to South America. Now, it wasn't just South America though. He opened the world's eyes to a new way of seeing the world at large. It, at this time, science is kind of at its zenith. It's right before science starts splitting up into its component parts, where you have, biology, and then all the little subdisciplines of biology over there, and then you got chemistry and all the subdisciplines of chemistry over here, and meteorology and climatology, and you on and on and on and on. Humboldt synthesized all of it into one universal way of looking at the planet we live on, and that's, he called it cosmos. He kind of invented that word, taking words from Greek, to mean basically this way of combining the knowledge of the world and a new way of thinking about it. He tied in climatology to botany, that plants grew in certain areas because not that's just where they were, but because of the climate at that area. He was able to map the climate zones of a mountain, of the volcanic mountain, and see that plants in that area were similar to plants in other areas that had similar climates. It was amazing how he could just look at something and see not just the individual, but the whole around it as well, how it all tied together. I don't think there's been a scientist really since that could do that, or even before that could do that. Alexander von Humboldt was, without a doubt, the most famous and the most influential scientist of his day. And we're talking about a time when there was Charles Darwin, Charles Lyell in geology, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson in America. John James Audubon in America as well. William Herschel in England. I mean, the Alexander von Humboldt was so well regarded and so well thought of and so influential. He influenced almost all of those people that I named in some form or fashion. Um, it was probably not Franklin, but definitely Jefferson, definitely Darwin, definitely Lyell, definitely later on Henry David Thoreau and John Muir. There's another book that I literally just finished a few days ago, that kind of talked about Humboldt in a different light and his influences and such. The man was just the most famous scientist in the world. Why have you never heard of him? Because he's German. And when World War One broke out and World War Two broke out, Americans, British, French, they wanted nothing to do with the Germans. So they kind of scrubbed the history clean of any sort of German influence, much to our loss, because Humboldt was mind blowing as far as what he was able to discover and tie together. So, if you've never heard of him, I highly recommend Humboldt's Cosmos, by Gerard Helfrich. This is 358 pages in length. It was published in 2004. Again, I had never heard of him before, but I've now finished two books about him. This one and a different one that I just finished, and the guy's amazing, seriously amazing. The breadth of his knowledge was unmatched. He knew about everything, and it wasn't just science. He also did history stuff too. He brought back Mayan as well, because he did do some Central American travels, but Incan, Mayan, Aztec, ancient texts, hieroglyphics, if you will, so that we were able to decode their writings and stuff. He was the one who brought some of that stuff back for the very first time. He had such a fascination with everything around him. It's unbelievable. So again, Humboldt's Cosmos by Gerard Helfrich. Um, again, just an amazing subject that unfortunately we don't hear about very often, if at all. All right, moving around, sticking around actually that same time period, the 19th century. this is actually one of the reasons that I've got into the history of science. I am a huge dinosaur nerd and natural history nerd. I studied geology in school. I'm wearing a trilobite shirt right now, and I love, love, love natural history, but chief among them is dinosaurs. I love dinosaurs, and always have. So when I was trying to find everything I could find out about dinosaurs, I obviously looked into, well, where did we first come upon these amazing animals? In the 1800s, the early 1800s. And so I picked up this book um, many years ago, but it's called Terrible Lizard by Deborah Cadbury. Um, the first dinosaur hunters and the birth of a new science. So basically, this is the beginnings of paleontology, dinosaurian paleontology. And this particular book was not just eye opening in that, hey, I'd never heard of these people. Of course, you may have heard of Sir Richard Owen. Um, may have heard of William Buckland, doubtful, but more than likely you've heard of Richard Owen if you have looked into the history of science at all. But Richard Owen was a bit of a jerk, and this book kind of spells this all out. He got into this massive feud with another British, actually a British doctor, a British country doctor by the name of Gideon Mantell. If you've never heard of him, I'm sorry, but the guy was not the most well known individual, even in his own little circle. He meant well. He tried to do things. He's credited with discovering the first herbivorous dinosaur, Iguanodon. He didn't actually find it. His wife found it. He was a country doctor, so he would travel around England visiting patients, and he would take his wife with him sometimes. And while he was visiting one particular patient, his wife was out in front of the yard, kind of kicking some stones around, and saw something and found it, and it was the teeth of an iguanodon. And that was the critical identifier for this herbivorous dinosaur because it was unlike anything else, and that's why it's got the name iguanodon because the tooth the teeth sorry looked like iguana's teeth, so iguanodon means iguana tooth. uh, but Mantell and Owen got into this massive argument, this massive feud even, and even though Mantell was this kind of barely hanging on country doctor and Sir Richard Owen had the ear of Queen Victoria, Richard Owen did everything in his power to basically railroad Gideon Mantell. It is unbelievable the lengths that this guy went to just kind of discredit Mantell, to take credit from of his dinosaur discoveries. It was insane. Richard Owen was just he was a bit of a control freak. But it also talks about other people, like again, Reverend William Buckland, who actually discovered and named the very first dinosaur ever, Megalosaurus, which means very big lizard. Um, so, it, Terrible Lizard, the first dinosaur hunters and the birth of a new science. Um, it opened my eyes not just to the history of paleontology, but the infighting, the bitter rivalries that people have and had back then. There's some humor in it when they try to reconstruct the dinosaurs. They are woefully incorrect. They were basing them on modern lizards and they just blew them up essentially, just expanded the size, made them really big. And they just are comical compared to what we know the dinosaurs look like today. And so again, this book was full of that sort of information about the early beginnings of paleontology from this just it's a rock, it's a piece of it's a this weird smudge in the rock to know, hey, this is an actual bone. And what kind of bone is it? Well, it actually is a bone of this particular animal that doesn't exist anymore. Another person who played a key role in here is Georges Cuvier in Paris. He plays a huge role in this, serving as kind of the foil to Sir Richard Owen in a way. Owen was Britain's leading anatomist. Cuvier was France's leading anatomist, and they had some differing opinions about things. And again, this it's all spelled out in this book, Terrible Lizard. Um, by Deborah Cadbury. Um, Written or published in 2000. It's about 374 pages in length. It was a pretty easy read, honestly, because again, it's something that I was deeply passionate about and was very curious about as well. All right, finishing things up, we're going to go over a little bit, but that's going to happen when I'm talking about books. There's no way I'm going to not talk about books and spend only a few minutes each time. Especially some of these books were just so amazing in my mind that I have to keep talking about them and spell things out. I want you to enjoy them. I'm hoping my enthusiasm rubs off. But the last book here kind of brings it all together here. It's called The Species Seekers, Heroes, Fools, and the Mad Pursuit of Life on Earth by Richard Conniff. Species Seekers was a pretty cool book. I picked it up a few years ago, actually probably about 15 years ago or so, and it was interesting. Again, it's the story of science, the early days, but it also continues up to fairly modern times. We're talking about the early 1900s to mid 1900s, and what it does is it tries to tell the stories of the people who would go out and try to find these new species of animals or organisms. And so then the mad pursuit, as it says on the cover, of trying to find life and categorizing it, ever since Carolus Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, came up with his binomial nomenclature to categorize the world at large. It became almost uh, a race, really, to try to name as many things as you could. Uh, and so the Species Seekers kind of talks about that, some of the dead ends, if you will, some of the more colorful characters that went through Africa, went through South America, just naming things, whether it already had a name or didn't yet, was irrelevant. It was just, hey, look, there's that. Oh, well, I'm going to name it this. But it also told a little bit of information about the curiosity that people had. There's quite a bit of information about, once again, Sir Richard Owen in here, and his ridiculous belief that different races were different, not just because of their skin, but because of their anatomical structure. He was quite convinced that um, apes kind of transitioned into white humans using black humans or even other racial um, groups as a transitional form. And so he compared chimpanzee skulls and gorilla skulls and orangutan skulls to Africans' skulls and Europeans' skulls. And obviously, he found that there's a difference between the humans and the apes, but he could not find any difference between, well, at least he actually couldn't, but he perceived there to be a difference between the Africans and the Europeans. Um, it's utterly fascinating. And then finally, the book finishes off actually talking about malaria and mosquitoes and the germ theory, and how even up until like the 1930s, when we were using mosquito nets and various pesticides to kill mosquitoes and saw the rate of malaria transmission drop, people still couldn't get their heads around that a tiny little insect was carrying an even tinier little thing inside that could make us sick. It was so foreign to them to think that the pinnacle of creation could get sick by something so insignificant. And well, it's true. Obviously, we can. We're seeing that right now with this virus. But even until the 1930s, people were still not believing that mosquitoes could transmit malaria. Um, it just was anathema to what they believed. So, a really really interesting book. Again, I recommend all of these books because I find them to be completely fascinating. I picked five of my history of science books that I felt kind of spelled out the interests in a chronological order, if you will, of this history of how we know what we know, which I find to be completely, so um, just so amazing and fascinating as well. So again, it's The Species Seekers, Heroes, Fools, and the Mad Pursuit of Life on Earth by Richard Conniff. It has 464 pages in length, and it was published in 2011, the most recent of the books that I have talked about today. So again, we had started off with The Eye of the Lynx, we have Measure of All Things, Humboldt's Cosmos, Terrible Lizard, and The Species Seekers. All very great books, all highly recommended. If any of those suit your fancy, please look them up. Try to get yourself a copy of them because you will not be disappointed, I promise. Uh, Next episode, episode 11, I don't know what we're going to talk about. Probably more COVID 19 or SARS CoV 2. I'm hoping not because, quite frankly, I was hoping this particular video series would be a lesson in how to know science literacy. But I've spent almost the entire time. I've done 8 episodes, 2 about books, but 8 in total about not about books, and only one so far has not been about SARS-CoV-2 or the coronavirus. Um, I don't know. It feels like that's all I have to talk about because that's what's out there, and there's so much misinformation. We might be talking about vaccines actually because that's a really big topic right now in the news. So who knows? I'll see you next time, and again, we'll figure things out. So um, thanks again for watching. This has been science literacy and the literacy side of things. Science literacy goes to the library, second edition. Thank you.